Shout on, pray on, we're gaining ground. Glory, hallelujah, the dead's alive and the lost is found. Glory, hallelujah.
Welcome back to Eschatology Matters. I am your host, Josh Howard, and I'm joined today by Ben Zeisloft. So, Ben, welcome, and thanks for joining me today, brother.
Yeah, great to be here.
So, Ben, you are coming from a similarly cold environment. I'm not sure if you have snow up there. We have snow here in Michigan. Where are you coming from, Ben? Give us a little bit of bio. If anybody is not following you on Twitter, let me throw this out at the very front end. Ben's a follow on Twitter. We'll get to that, at the tail end as well. But Ben, where are you at? What are you up to?
Yeah, thanks, brother. I'm in Philadelphia, so I am the editor of the Sentinel, the Republic Sentinel, which is a brand new Christian conservative news outlet. So we're doing bread and butter conservative news, but we're all Christians who own and operate it. So it's going to have that worldview and be informed by the truth, eternal truth of God, our triune God. So that's what I'm doing on a day-to-day basis. So writing, editing, commenting on cultural matters, especially that pertain to Christians and people of our persuasions. So that's what I'm up to.
Awesome. So the Sentinel, you were previously at Daily Wire, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So is this connected? Is the Sentinel connected to Daily Wire, or is this a standalone venture? How does that look?
This is a standalone venture. Yeah.
Okay.
So if you know Nathan Barnes, he's also active on social media. He's one of our co-founders, but he and one other Christian guy, just solid dudes, launched this end of last year, I believe, and brought me on this summer as the editor.
Very good. No, Christian news content is always welcome. So I'm encouraged to hear that. Where can people, before I forget at the tail end, where can people find the Sentinel? What sort of articles, like what sort of frequency are you guys publishing? What's that look like for people to keep up with you guys?
Yep. So we're publishing news daily, at least 2 articles a day, and then usually one on Sunday for a special Sunday edition. So that'll be more theological content. But we're at republicsentinel.com, and you can find us on Twitter at repubsentinel.
Okay. No, thanks for that. So, Ben, there's so many things I'd love to chat with you about today. So we'll try to narrow it down. But one of the things that I'd mentioned to you before we started recording was just Christians and politics, just in general. If somebody thinks, how does this fit into eschatology? One of the things we always try to emphasize at Eschatology Matters is a kind of a whole Bible or a whole worldview eschatology, not just a couple of chapters, but instead seeing the tenor of that whole story that God has written across Scripture and across time and eternity, and then seeing how we fit into that and how that whole story honors and glorifies Christ. So thinking in that regard, I think Christians in politics, and we could say interactions of church and state, even to kind of zoom out a little farther, they play into this quite a bit. Christians often find themselves in places that are not kind to Christianity, nor kind to God's standards and God's laws. So what do you think, like, as we think about Christians in politics, obviously you're with a news agency that is maybe you wouldn't frame it as political, but you're at least engaging in the politics of the day. You're putting out thought pieces. How does a Christian approach politics? And what would you say to those, for example, who would just say, this is the Thanksgiving dinner conversation. I washed my hands of it. We should have nothing to do with politics. Leave that to the pagans. Like, what's your approach on those type of matters?
Yeah, that's a great question. A Christian should approach politics as Christians. So when you get saved, when you repent of your sins and you trust in Jesus Christ, everything about you should change, right? The way that you interact with your family, the way that you think, the way that you move, how you spend your time, it should all be submitted to the Lordship of Christ. So I think it's a natural outflow from the Christian politics is a natural outflow from the question of, how could I honor Christ in the political realm, in the civil sphere, if you will. So what we're seeing, especially right now, is Christian men realizing what time it is, so to speak, and entering into that civil sphere saying, Christ is Lord here too. And I have a duty to honor him, not only in my personal life, not only, Sunday morning worship, my devotional time in the morning, and maybe Bible study on Wednesday night, but also, how my state is governed, how my country is governed, what laws are being passed, what laws are being enforced. So I think it's pretty obvious that God has thoughts about how some of those things could go. And that gets into the theonomy question and how precisely we should apply the general equity of God's law to the civil sphere. But it's obvious, I think, to most Christians that, yes, God is not agnostic as to whether or not babies are murdered under the cover of our laws. So people are waking up to that, especially with the tyranny over the past 3 years. And it's been exciting as a reporter, as a journalist, covering important stories that are key moments in those realizations.
Yeah. No, I'm glad you said waking up because that was going to be a follow-up question. Well, and I'll go ahead and ask it, but what's your take on I guess the temperature? Everybody's talking about what time it is, but just keeping up with, are Christians becoming more engaged politically? And I suspect the answer is going to be yes, but I'd love you to walk us through that because, you're active on Twitter. I'm not active on Twitter, but I peek on there every so often, and I jump out before anybody sees that I'm there. But Twitter's not real life, but you do see a whole lot of Christian interaction, Christian engagement, where I don't think you saw as much of that explicit Christian interaction and Christian engagement with the culture around us. You mentioned kind of that every square inch Kuyperian thought process. You're hearing things like that from corners that I would not have heard in 3 years ago, maybe even, right? So what's your take on that? Is this maybe a moment of revival or reformation within the Christian church that we're getting a little more serious about those issues? What's been your take?
Yeah, I certainly think so. So by way of bio, I came to the Reformed faith in 2019. I grew up evangelical, so when I came to college, I had some Reformed Baptist and Presbyterian friends who exposed me to Calvinism in those discussions about the doctrines of grace. And so the past few years of my life, I've been just diving into some good theology, reformers, Puritans, things of that nature, solid sermons from solid people. And I think the past couple of decades have really been that for a lot of people, of the Reformed resurgence, the young restless and Reformed. But I think where that's going is as we discover Jonathan Edwards and John Calvin and even older like Augustine, Chrysostom, Athanasius, we're realizing that there's this whole massive corpus of knowledge that Christians have developed and passed down, just doing basic exegesis from the Bible. And as that tyranny encroaches, now we're able to look back and see, well, okay, Christianity isn't 100 years old, didn't start with Billy Graham. So what have our ancestors, our forebears done over the past 19, 20 centuries to answer these questions? So really, I think everything we're seeing in the civil sphere with Christians, and especially Reformed Christians, starting to engage in government and ask those questions is natural outflow of what God has been doing already in our culture for the past few decades. And it's very, very encouraging. It's only going to get better from here, I think.
Yeah. No, that's so encouraging because I remember, well, I mean, I remember during, the Troubles, which is what I call the days of, I don't know if we can say COVID on YouTube anymore, but or at this point, but back during the Troubles, I remember people rediscovering Luther and realizing Luther lived through a plague, and so you're starting to retrieve a little bit of that. It's just been like a wellspring at this point. People digging in, like you said, to Christians across the centuries. Are you seeing that in politics? I wonder because you kind of have your thumb on the pulse of a lot of political arenas that the common Christian, myself certainly, I don't have. What's your take on that? Are we seeing more Christians involved in politics from your perspective, or what's that look like?
Yeah, definitely. So this gets into the whole Christian nationalism debate of how should Christ's laws, how should the rule of Christ impact our nation?
You went there quick, Ben. You brought us there quick, brother. Go ahead.
Yeah, my bad. Anything I say from here on out, or we both say is my fault. Sorry about that. So I think at one end you have like your Marjorie Taylor Greene, who she has some kind of Christian enculturation, and she pays lip service to Christian nationalism. I don't know if she's that theologically robust or anything like that. But she's at least trying to ask the question. I don't know to what extent it is in good faith, but then you see our Reformed friends, like people like Dusty Deevers, who are running for office in Oklahoma State Senate, saying, it is a positive duty that I have to protect my family and as a shepherd to protect my church even. And they commissioned me to go and run for office and try to influence just the tyranny that's coming from our state and from the federal government as well. I think that's you see Christians more and more willing to do that. And actually, right after Dusty ran for office, I talked to two guys, one in Ohio, one in Kentucky, who were both considering runs and wanted to get plugged into some people who could help them. So people are starting to watch people like Dusty get involved, and he might be, the first break in the dam, but it's only going to continue. And people are fed up across the country. They don't like being trampled on, especially if you're Christians, conservatives, just want to live a quiet and peaceful life in the fear of God, like First Timothy says. So at some point, we have to get out of the four walls of our church and actually stop the tyranny at the source of it, which is unfortunately our governments.
Yeah. And I want to talk about the governments. Let me put a pin in that for the next comment. But talking about Dusty Deevers, we've kept up with him and we're so encouraged by seeing that win. And I remember seeing him win and that speech, like you were just referring to, where he was so bold. If anybody watching this hasn't seen it, it was so bold for somebody who had just taken a seat of office. A lot of times people kind of tamper their speech, it seems, in those moments, not so with Dusty. But I remember thinking a couple things when I heard him speak. I remember thinking, number one, that's really rare to hear a politician of any stripe, even a professing Christian, speak like that. Number two, it's not historically rare at all. Like this, in many times past, this would have been, unremarkable. And then number three, I remember the silence of some that weren't supporting him was palpable. And I hate to be that guy pointing around, but that just seems like something that a lot of Christians should be able to get behind. So.
Right.
Well, that was interesting. But you see that kind of as a portent, hopefully, for things to come, maybe encouraging others.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, I definitely see that. I think there's a hunger for it, and people are searching around for good resources. So there's all these new institutions cropping up to answer those questions. So I've done some contribution for American Reformer, which is a great magazine trying to do some retrieval and some more philosophical, political thoughts in the Protestant tradition about these questions. So yeah, there's people who are asking and answering these questions, and I think there's going to be good fruit that's getting born.
Very good. So let's jump into the state a bit, because that's a clearly eschatological topic, right? You and I were chatting about eschatology before the show, and this isn't forcing it in. The state, whatever your eschatological view, the state is a beast one must grapple with. What is I guess maybe what is the approach of a Christian in a paganizing culture? Like, how ought we view the state? What have been maybe some wisdom that you have garnered along your path and in your writing that could encourage Christians in a culture that is not just ambivalent toward Christianity, but from the state level seemingly antagonistic toward Christian faith?
Yeah. Well, going back to first principles, just as a Christian with my Bible, reading Romans 13 and 1 Peter 2, the state is a deacon of God, a servant of God that is meant to punish the evildoer and reward the one who does good. So that immediately asks the question, what is good and what is evil, right? And God's word explicitly warns us against those who define good and evil for themselves and call evil good and good evil. So, that we have to start that from the foundational world, but just like we do everything else as Christians, is what does God say? What says the Lord? What saith the Lord? And just from there, you can see that the state has grown way bigger than it should be, both in our state governments with education, healthcare, and the federal government with foreign wars and those same issues, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, trying to be the nanny state to fill into the roles of the family and the church in inappropriate ways. So I think the battle over the next few decades is going to be Christians rediscovering what it is that the state ought to do, and then calling the state back to that standard. And it's going to take Christian men like Dusty and just people who are willing to not compromise and say what is eternally true, no matter who hears it. Obviously, Dusty's race we were following at the Sentinel. We interviewed him. We did some coverage of Bart Barber, the president of the SBC, donating to his primary opponent in the Republican primary. But Dusty that whole time was doubling and tripling and quadrupling down on the Christian worldview, and even pushing the envelope, saying we should really reconsider no-fault divorce and legal pornography. And he was outgunned and outspent in every way by both the Republicans and the Democrats, and he still won because his church surrounded him. They knocked doors for him. I think it was something like 6,000 doors he knocked by himself over the past few months. Just wow. So it goes to show that when the people want it, and there's enough Christian cultural influence in a certain area, it'll happen, right? They just need some direction and leadership, especially from the pulpit, from a man like Dusty. But that's how I'm sort of thinking through it. Is we're in a time where strong men are rising up, and people are rallying around them because they're courageous and they're willing to stand up to the tyranny that surrounds us.
Yeah, and it's interesting. You'd mentioned the the government bloat, which I think you'd probably get a yes and amen from most people. If you said, the government's too big, you'd probably get that. But it seems like the responses from both sides, whether one is Christian or non, or conservative, or, whatever camp one places oneself in, it seems like the response is always, what can the government do? So you brought up the Christian nationalism conversation, whether you are for that or against that or somewhere in the mix. It seems like it's always the question of, like, what can the government enforce? And you brought up, the Bible actually speaks to the reach and breadth of a government. And it's been in my experience, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this. It's been in my experience, I don't think most Christians really have considered that the Bible actually might speak to how big a state should be. So we would look around and say, well, yeah, the state controls 90% of my life, but that's just the state of things here. And you're suggesting, if I'm hearing you correctly, like, no, there's actually biblical guidelines as to that, and probably some theologians of the past that have wrestled with that.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll even hear from the libertarian side of things, or even the more further right conservatives who are secular and not Christian. You'll hear them say, "Oh, the government is too big in the area of criminal justice, so we need to not give them the power to, have capital punishments." That's actually where the government should be big. The government should have a monopoly on execution and criminal justice and handling those matters and establishing restitution. And I think that's actually an area where the government is too small, and we need to give them powers back to, make sure that the death penalty is applied to murderers and rapists and things of that nature. So it's the government is too big where it should be small, and it's too small where it should be big. And the only reason you can get there, reason there is with the Bible and just with some basic understanding of Christian history and how we thought about these questions. If you're just trying to slam everything into a secularized, government too big, government too small worldview, it's not going to work. You're going to have government that's too big in some areas and too small in others. So I guess that's why Christian principles matter in these discussions, and we can't just leave our faith at the door with them.
Right. I wonder, how do you prepare people, or how do you guys approach, because again, you're writing for the Sentinel, you write for other publications as well. American Reformer, you'd mentioned them a minute ago. I wonder how you walk Christians through being an enemy of the state. And I say that not to be, hyperbolic or overly throw terms about, but I think it's shocking for a lot of Christians to walk through, number one, biblical examples of many Christian figures in Scripture who were killed not because of their faith, but because they were enemies of the state. I think we could even point toward the cross and say, that was a declaration that Christ was an enemy of the state. As for many of those that followed him, also looking down through Christian history and seeing many, many, many martyrs, where we look back and say they died for their faith, but no, actually the charges that were levied against them were that they were enemies of the state. I wonder, how do you address those through your publications, or how do you walk a Christian through thinking of, because I think, you mentioned Romans 13. Most Christians want to be good citizens, right? Like we want to do the right thing, and we generally want the state to give us a pat on the back. And it's frustrating or maybe even disorienting when the state does not give us that pat on the back and instead says, no, you're actually doing evil. How do you prepare toward that? And how has the Sentinel and your other publications been addressing those sort of issues?
Yeah, so in terms of what the Sentinel is doing, we've actually seen a lot of organic growth just from covering Christians who are in that sort of situation. So most recently it was Michael Cassidy who beheaded the Baphomet statue in Iowa, and we got first dibs on that story. His lawyer called me a few hours after it happened and told me all the details. So we were able to publish it first and got a lot of growth and attention from that. And praise be to God for all that, right? That was a great providential,
Absolutely.
Yeah, pat on our backs. So we covered Lizzie Marbach getting fired from Ohio Right to Life a few months ago. We covered Marcus Schroeder being arrested just by reading the Bible at a drag queen event in Wisconsin. So you're right, like the state and even the institutional rights, the conservative Republican institutions are cracking down on Christians, saying that the Christian worldview isn't appropriate or welcome, or it's not inclusive enough. And we're trying to cover those as much as possible and infuse it with the Christian worldview. So we interviewed all three of those people I mentioned, Marcus Schroeder and Lizzie Marbach and Michael Cassidy. They just had very simple thoughts about the matter. I'm a Christian. I'm going to act like a Christian in every area of my life, including where that happens to interact with the state. And in terms of you're absolutely right that Christians have made themselves enemy of the state, not on purpose through history, but just because, again, like it goes back to 1 Timothy 2. Our goal is to live quiet and peaceful lives. But the state often is getting cues from the enemy rather than the God to whom they're supposed to be serving. So that looks like crackdowns on religious liberty for Christians, but we're trying to cover issues like that too. There's countless examples we report on, like pronoun policies in workplaces and schools, court battles to that effect. So you're right. It's never, you believe in the Nicene Creed, you affirm the Athanasian Creed, therefore you're an enemy of the state. It's no, you won't use the right pronouns, you're an enemy of the states, right? So it's never going to be some upfront opposition to Christianity proper. It's always going to be some area of Christian obedience. And that's where they're going to get you. So especially in our time, it's the LGBTQ issues, homosexuality, transgenderism. Those are the topics that quickly get you canceled, especially if you're in a big corporate workforce. I'm privileged working in a job like mine where I work for Christians and with Christians, so I don't have to worry about that so much, which is why I'm a little bit more plainly spoken on social media and those avenues. But there are real pressures, and you're right, people have to be aware of them and know how to deal with them. So we're trying to provide content and coverage to that effect.
Yeah. So I want to talk about Well, number one, I want to talk about Lizzie Marbach here in a minute and the state of the pro-life uh, movement, or anyway, the state of those things. Let me ask though. So you mentioned the Baphomet statue, and I mean, what a time to be alive that a Baphomet statue, number one, was erected, but then beheaded. Um, there's a lot going on with that story. I encourage everybody to check out your interview on that. But just walk us through that a little bit. What some of your reflections were on that, because here's kind of what's in the background of my thinking. I'm wondering how you and how the Sentinel and how these Christian organizations are. How do we lead Christians who are struggling? And I say these Christians are struggling with, to what extent do we stand against evil? To what extent do we? And we can all recognize, like, the Baphomet statue seems to have been, pretty symbolic. Like the group that erected it, I think they profess not even to believe in Satan or God. So, like, there's a lot of symbolism there. But, like, how do you walk through whether being a Benedict option or whether being a Boniface option, to kind of use those type of terms? But how do you frame that for Christians who are looking at that and saying, okay, it's evil, but I'm not quite sure what to do with it or how to respond to it. I'm not sure what's too far. What were some of the, I don't know, any gleanings you might have had from that interview and from that interaction?
Well, yeah, my first thought when I heard that it was specifically beheaded and not just destroyed was Genesis 3:15 is the seed of the woman crushing the seed of the serpent's head. So that was glorious. That getting into eschatology. That's an eschatological story of
That's it.
The seed of the woman, which is Christ, but also by extension his bride, his people, and also the seed of the serpent, which is Satan, the prince and power of the air, but also by extension his people, his offspring. So Jesus in John chapter 8 accused the Pharisees, says the Pharisees are actually children of the devil because they're liars and they're murderers. And I think we're seeing that in our day, where the seed of the serpent is chasing down the seed of the woman, even just in the Western world and American culture. But that was a reminder of the victory of Christ is the beheading of Satan at the cross, and then consummating that reality on the last day at the resurrection, when God judges the world in righteousness by the man whom he has appointed. So that was the first thing that came to mind with Michael Cassidy doing that, just on an optimistic level, right? We talked about optimistic eschatology before we started rolling, but Christians should take hope that that's not only that is a future reality, but it's progressively a reality in this age where you see real Christian victories and advancement through the church age as we fulfill the Great Commission. So those are my first thoughts. But in terms of just what the limiting principle is, that's the question I'm still trying to answer. I think everybody sort of knows in their heart of hearts, especially if you're a God-fearing person, that a statue of Satan in a building that was erected to honor God with just laws and just decrees is too far. So it should not have been approved in the first place. You can get into the legal argument of it, where, from my understanding, talking to Davis Yance, Michael Cassidy's lawyer, there's never been in the history of the United States a recognition that Satanism is a valid religion under the First Amendment. So it never should have been approved. People like Governor Kim Reynolds in Iowa and the representatives who were defending the existence of that statue should have been working hard instead of saying, oh, we have to allow it because of religious liberty. They should have been the first ones to actually go and remove it. And ideally through the legal process, right? I think we can all agree as Christians as well that we don't resort to going to a state and just taking down the statue. Right. But I think Michael Cassidy did it pretty well in that he wasn't violent. He turned himself right into police. He destroyed the statue. He beheaded it. He threw out the head. And then he said, I committed this misdemeanor. And they gave him a citation, and he went on his merry way. So the line is somewhere between, we've crossed that line when we have statues of the enemy of God, a figure that represents lying and murdering, in pure evil, a pure evil spirit, erected in buildings that are supposed to honor Christ as Lord.
Yeah. So I wonder, in your conversations with Michael Cassidy on that, obviously he's coming at it from a citizen's perspective, right? He's a guy, a veteran. If I remember correct, a Navy fighter pilot veteran, I believe.
Yep.
So anyway, so he's not a representative of the state. I wonder, did you in those talks and in those articles or the interview that came out, did you guys at all entangle with issues of blasphemy or public displays of blasphemy? Because you'd mentioned earlier kind of the Christian nationalism theonomic debates. It seems inevitable that in these discussions, one comes to that place of, should the state prevent such things? If somebody says, I want to put Satan up in the Capitol, the state step in and say no. Or is there some sort of, room for religious religious liberty, religious pluralism, however you want to frame that. But did that come up at all?
I didn't talk to Michael Cassidy about that. I think he was mostly convicted on the point that Satanism would never have been seen as a valid religion by the founders or anybody who had any hand in building Western civilization or even building this country. And those are questions that I want to answer too. The blasphemy law question: do we enforce both the second table and the first table of the law from a governmental standard? So I'm going to be digesting content like crazy over the next few months about that, and I have done over the last few months as well. But clearly some of our forebears thought that it was a good idea to have public crackdowns on explicit blasphemy like that, like erecting an altar to Satan. I think there is room for freedom of conviction. That's obviously religious toleration came about in the Western world because of Christianity, because we recognize that God gives not only explicit instructions in his word, but also the conscience, right? Every Christian has a conscience, and we're told by the apostle that we are accountable to God in accordance with how we obey that conscience as well. So those are discussions that need to be had, and I'm going to be learning along with everybody else on that.
Excellent. No, that's fair. And it is certainly that's not a quick conversation by any means. It's been interesting though to watch these things unfold. Just from my perspective, eschatology in general kind of seems to bring a lot of heated disagreement at times. But you start talking about the application of God's law and specifically first, second table issues. Yeah, buckle up. Yeah, right. Like there's
really.
fireworks to be had there. No, but that's really encouraging to hear. So tell us a little bit about Lizzie Marbach. Many in our shared circles, I believe, are involved in either pro-life or would frame ourselves as abolitionists. The preservation of the lives of the unborn. What exactly happened over there in Ohio? What was your interaction with? Well, what did you find from the state of things? Because one of the things that I think has been shocking for a lot of Christians, Apologia just put out a little documentary or whatever they called it on sort of the state of things. I believe they looked at specifically at Louisiana at the bill that was stymied down there. But what was some of your interaction from that, and what is the state currently of the pro-life establishment?
Yeah, those are some great questions. So that's another area we've been really careful to cover on is the abolitionist movement and those questions about pro-life versus incrementalism versus immediatism, those issues as they come up in state legislatures, in denominational bodies. So starting with Lizzie Marbach, she was the communications director for Ohio Right to Life, and she had a lot of internal disagreements with other staff members about messaging and taking a bolder approach. So in the months leading up to her firing, she had called a pro-abortion advocate a murderer on Twitter, or somebody who was advocating for murder, something like that, and she got a rebuke from her boss saying you shouldn't call people murderers. And she was like, "What are you talking about? They're advocating for murder. Of course we should say this is what you're doing." So sort of those questions about tone, so to speak, came up in the months leading up to her firing. But it all came to a head with that exchange with Max Miller, whose wife sits on the board of Ohio Right to Life. And Lizzie had tweeted something pretty standard for a Christian. She said something to the effect of, "There's no hope for any of us except for faith in Jesus Christ alone." And Max Miller, Republican congressman who happens to be Jewish, he accused her of not being tolerant, something to that effect. And that was sort of the last incident in that stream of events where she ended up getting fired from Ohio Right to Life. But she's another great follow on Twitter. She's definitely a firecracker and very bold on the issue of the right to life and guaranteeing that for preborn babies in our culture. But in terms of the state of things, it's been encouraging to see people really interrogating the presuppositions of the pro-life movement and saying, is this really trying to honor Christ as Lord, or is it just clever 4D chess politics, right? So actually, I'm in the middle of writing an article about Tony Lowinger, who's the chairman of Oklahomans for Life down in Oklahoma, and he's trying to re-legalize abortion in the cases of rape and incest for fear that another referendum like they just had in Ohio, where they enshrined abortion into their constitution, will actually come to Oklahoma. So his logic is we need to make sure that rape and incest murders are legal in our state so that we won't lose this particular election that may or may not come. And at that point, you have to ask yourself, what is actually driving him? It's clearly not the biblical worldview, which says do not, frame iniquity by decree, establish justice. God is the father to the fatherless and protector of widows, right? So all those basic building blocks for Christian political theory. He clearly doesn't have them. And I think people are when they're looking to give in terms of volunteer hours, in terms of money, they don't want to go to somebody like that. They want to go to a Christian who's going to engage abortion Christianly. And, it goes right back to the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. It's actually the exact same conversation we're having, right? Because it's the serpent who's destroying the image of God in man, waging war against heaven, and we have to cut off his head. The question is, how do we cut off his head? And I think people are realizing that, for the past 50 years, even after Roe was overturned, whatever we're doing isn't working. So really we need to shift the conversation toward, this is what God says about it. Murder is wrong because God said to Moses on Sinai, you shall not murder. We should actually be saying that in the public square.
Yeah, it's compelling to see a lot of the drama unfold in those state legislatures that we've seen over the last couple of months, and oftentimes the pro-life establishment standing against those who are trying to pass bills of abolition. I think it's interesting too. Part of what I'm hearing you say, I don't think you didn't use the phrase, but it's a question of whether a Christian can support or even acquiesce to something that God hates.
Right.
So if God hates this thing, whatever the cost or whatever the difficulty, we cannot support or acquiesce to this thing that God hates. And then we could talk through the details, but we can't be in support of it. It's interesting that seems to be picking up a lot of speed in a really hard time, because a lot of the pushback that I've heard against these sort of things is that you're essentially you're tilling ground that's never going to be planted. You're preparing for something that's an impossibility. I live in Michigan. We were ahead of the curve with Ohio. We did it a year before Ohio did. It's tough. So I think for a lot of Christians, they look around and say, well, we'll take what we can get. But that doesn't seem to be, it seems like more Christians are maybe picking up that drumbeat of opposing the things that God hates, which is interesting from a political standpoint, that a movement that seems to have not a whole lot of immediate promise is picking up steam. Do you get that sense from interacting with the abolitionist movement, among other things?
Yeah, certainly. And I think it's no accident that a lot of abolitionists hold to a very, optimistic view of the future. Not in terms of we're definitely going to win, in the United States of America in 2023, every single political battle, right? It may very well be that we're persecuted and we'll never be able to pass a law again, right? But I think we do have the mindset of we're going to win in history, and our job is to obey the revealed will of God. So his revealed will, like you said, is to not frame iniquity by statute, right? To not do what is evil that good may come. And if you really zoom out, over the past 2,000 years, none of our peoples, in the West were Christian. We were all Druids or Celts or something like that, and we were sacrificing animals and humans to, Donner and Thor and Zeus and all these different false deities, just like much of the world still is today. But the reason that the West is so great is because of the influence of Christianity, that grace really is working up throughout history, that God is truly reconciling the world to himself. So for me, anyway, when I stand before the Lord, I want to be able to say that I fought this particular battle that you put before me with that in mind, knowing that my duty is to obey. I'm not smarter than you. I can read your word and see what you want and push for that, instead of trying to play 10-dimensional chess like some pro-life lobbyists are.
Yeah.
So again, it goes back into the view of the future. Are we going to be successful in history? I think maybe we can get into this too. But the super pessimistic mindset of, well, Jesus is probably going to come back like next week, so why even bother, is very damaging. But I think Christians are realizing that's more a modern tradition than a true historic Christian belief. And as they reject that, they pick up the mantle, right, the sword, the trowel of abolishing abortion to the glory of God.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and push right in on that then, because you mentioned eschatological optimism, and I would like you to defend, Ben, how on earth you can have an optimism covering the stories you cover and writing the things on topics you have to write. Where does that sense of optimism come from? What does that look like? It's been interesting with eschatological conversations. We have many brothers and sisters of various eschatological conviction and proclivity within Christendom, and we're grateful for them. But it seems that there's it's almost offensive to some Christians for you to suggest that things will improve, and even not in the near term, but in any term. That really upsets some Christians in a way that's quite puzzling, I think, at times. justify your optimism. What sort of optimism does this look like for you, Ben?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. So just a bunch of passages popped to my mind. So I'll see if I can sort through them in my head. But start with just the Great Commission, right? The mandate is to go and win the world to Christ. Go to the nations, tell them what Christ has done, baptize them, disciple them. So not just, make converts, but make Christians, make disciples who will not only, confess Christ as Lord in their private life, but in every area of their life. I think you've seen that actually work throughout history, right? Just the church just plugging along at that Great Commission over the ages. And, there's been great fruit that's been born. We see it a lot in the West. We saw it in the East to this day, but also, before Islam, there was thriving Eastern Christendom. And you're seeing it over the past couple of centuries with the modern missions movement just spread to every last corner of the globe. And it's amazing. And we get to be part of that work. We get to actually truly, tangibly, build that cathedral that's going to last until eternity. So that's one for sure. It's just the basic conviction that Jesus was not lying when he said that you should go and do the Great Commission, right? It's actually going to work. It's going to be successful. And not because we're that powerful. We're his helpmeet, right? We're his bride. So he's doing all the heavy lifting. We're just obeying, and he's working through that obedience and ruling and reigning on the earth in that sense. Also just Isaiah 2 comes to mind. That's one of my favorite passages in Isaiah of just all the nations streaming and bringing their treasures to the mountain of the Lord. And that's, I think, what you've seen over the past 2,000 years, and we'll continue to see that, is just the best fruits of the nations being submitted to the lordship of Christ and recognizing him as king. So I believe that even for the United States, right? Maybe China will invade in 10 years and we'll all be butchered and destroyed. But I'm going to fight like we're going to be here for another 1,000 years, and my kids and grandkids will be here for millennia. So I'm not giving up, right?
Absolutely. And just for the record, since you are on the political beat, that wasn't insider information leaking out about China, was it? That was just yeah, freewheeling speculation, right?
Yeah, no, we're good.
No, I think that's helpful. This is all anecdotal and kind of just personal experience. But growing up, I remember a lot of Christians that were living for the next 10 years, and they hoped for 10 years. And they were expecting a cataclysmic event typically. I don't remember a lot of Christians, at least that spoke about living for 1,000 years, but I'm hearing a lot more of that now. And that's interesting because, you're quoting from Isaiah. I would say that's a much more biblical impetus, living with the expectation of generations down the road. And if Christ chooses to come, praise God and glory to his name, and yet planning for a future. Yeah, no, that's really good. How does that hopeful view, this might be a little bit of a softball, but I wonder how your eschatological view, which you're developing, and your eschatological view, most of us are still learning. I would hope all of us are still learning and honing what we see in Scripture and trying to arrive at a knowledge of the truth in these matters. How has that impacted your particular work? Because I read what you post, and it's typically upbeat, but I just know the story is there's a lot of weight in the world, right? Like there's a lot of darkness that you have to cover as part of your vocation. How does your eschatology help with that?
Yeah, so even from a ground level, this is a Christian business, right? These are a couple of Christian guys getting together and making money to provide for our families and of course influencing the world. But really, what you don't see on day-to-day level is that money feeds our families, right? I earn money so I can take care of my wife and give food for our dog and put gas in the car and that sort of thing. So those are also just faithful day-to-day movements that fit in that grand scheme of eternity. And the eschaton that maybe you don't see is just, I'm doing what I do in order to provide for my family and leading family worship and bringing my family to church on a Sunday morning. So, that's why I can be upbeat in hard times, because I know that God blesses just those day-to-day movements of faithfulness. And in terms of, I guess, the work, it's encouraging to my heart just to see Christians stand, whether they're winning victories or taking losses, and just still going back to God and saying this is all to his glory. So whether you're Lizzie Marbach getting fired or Dustin Deevers winning an election, it's the same. I see the same operating principle, which is, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So that's why, there's tons of stories that we just cover, that you can probably read in a lot of conservative outlets. But when I get to cover those, exclusive Christian stories, interviews, that's really what moves my own heart is just seeing, these are people who love the Lord Jesus Christ and are submitted to obeying him. So that's what motivates me.
No, that's good. That's encouraging. The small things are not that small, right? Like the home life. These things are not trivial. These things are building blocks of the kingdom. Let's wrap up with this, Ben. I'm wondering, and this is just kind of broad brushstrokes. Where are you seeing some battles, and who are you seeing fighting them that are encouraging? And what I mean, obviously, by the battles, what are some like really key issues? We've been talking about a couple, I suspect, but like what are some of the key battlegrounds that you're seeing flash up right now that are worth engaging for Christians to think through? And who are some of the people that are fighting on those battlefields that one might look to? You've mentioned the Sentinel that you're writing with. American Reformer is another one. We've mentioned Dusty Deevers, who he's associated with. Is it Abolitionist Rising or something like that? But anyway, who do you see out there that is worthwhile to follow, to be encouraged and informed? And what are some of those kind of flashpoints in the battles?
Yeah. So I think the obvious flashpoints are, those social issues we're facing. So the fruit of the sexual revolution with abortion, transgenderism, homosexuality. So fighting against those cultural tides, trying to pass laws that beat back those evils, and obviously, of course, as Christians, spreading the gospel and trying to influence culture in those senses too. But really, I think people should be following, and this is what I've been doing over the past few years, is anybody who has a positive cultural vision for the future, who's not just reacting to stuff as it comes up, but actually building things. So I know lots of men like that who are building businesses, companies. You see that a lot in Moscow, right? So people like to bash Doug Wilson, and I have my own reservations about some of the things he's said and done, but I can really appreciate him and a lot of other guys up there who are really serving as a model for a lot of Christians, and I'm seeing that desire crop up across the country. So, I think in 20 years, it's not just going to be Moscow, Idaho, but there's probably going to be Moscow, Idahos all over the country.
Lord willing, right?
Yeah, just getting together and being Christians together, doing the daily movements of human life, making meals, building companies, running for office, preaching the gospel, having church, just together. And with that optimism and that positive culture that wants to do all things to the glory of God. And we've lacked that for a long time in the United States. And I think it's coming back, and it's very encouraging. And again, it get back to the first part of the conversation where we're going back to the rock from which we were cut. We're reading old writers, and we're looking beyond the past 100 years of Christian history to see, what our forebears did and how we can continue their project until Christ returns. So anybody like that who you're seeing, trying to think of some guys who have been recently encouraged by Joshua Hames. He had I think he got viral on Twitter because he had some posts about how post-millennialism destroyed his church plan. So he was an early church planner and decided that he needed to be a little bit more strategic for the future. He's a good follow. Jamie Banbrick, who's in Northern Ireland, I've been encouraged by him too. His YouTube channel. There's lots of guys. You can you log onto Twitter and you can be edified all day by them.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you mentioned two that have been on our channel a couple of times. No, Josh and Jamie, solid guys. Jamie cheats because he has the Irish accent, which just makes everything sound better. But
right.
Yeah.
No, and also just and just to add, So I think Brett Braggett has been on this channel, correct?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, he's also a great follower. He's one of the most underrated preachers of our time. Just a great. You can tell he's cut from that rock of the Puritans, but nobody knows his name. That's probably a good thing. I'm keeping him secret, but he's a great guy. Just if you're looking for good Christian sermons content, he's a good follow, a good person to pay attention to. A lot of abolitionists, you see them, fighting on the front lines of should a woman be criminalized for an abortion, but really those are just faithful people, everyday moms and dads who are raising families and being active church members and going about their day-to-day jobs. A lot of them are good people to associate with and follow too. And even if you're not persuaded to the abolitionist mindset yet, they're good people who are good fighters, and I'm sure they'll be an encouragement to you.
Oh, that's solid. We'll be keeping up with the Sentinel and what you've got going on. Can you remind everybody just like your Twitter handle, the website there for the Sentinel, or the Twitter handle, just where people can kind of keep up with what you have coming out, Ben?
Yes. So, my own Twitter is at Ben Zeisloft. The Sentinel is at Republic Sentinel. Our website is republicsentinel.com. And I should actually plug quickly. We have a documentary called SEALs Beat Biden, which chronicles some Navy SEALs and some other service members who fought back against the Biden military vaccine mandate. So that's a great watch. A lot of those people, actually, I think pretty much all of them are believers in those in our interviews that we did with them for our documentary. So that's I'd encourage people to go and watch that and sign up to watch that as well. But we'll be having a lot more in the future, and excited for what's to come.
I completely forgot to mention that documentary. I'm glad you brought that up. What an incredible story, man, and some of those testimonies. But Ben, love the work coming out. Encourage everybody to follow you. But thanks for joining us today, brother.
Yeah, thank you, brother. Appreciate it.
Seated here at my right hand, the Lord to my Lord did command, for of these heathen I will make a kingly footstool for your sake.